Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush. Hey, just a quick reminder, as always, there's an important disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to hear. Hey, as we continue on this journey of learning about the markets we watch, personally, and I don't know about you listeners out there, but I've been spending a lot of time trying to get my head around Bitcoin or digital currencies and the fascinating technology and ideas underneath it. And on my research travel, I've come across a wide range of sites that have information on this subject. As a matter of fact, we at the agency, we thought it would be a good idea to have a dedicated page for providing some information on Bitcoin and other digital currencies. And you can find that at cftc.gov/Bitcoin. So if you get a chance, check it out. But back to the research travels. So one of the places I came across was coincenter.org. And according to their website, CoinCenter is the leading nonprofit research and advocacy center focused on the public policy issues facing cryptocurrency and decentralized computing technologies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. I always mispronounce that last currency, but Ethereum, there you go. So today, I'm so pleased to have on the research director from CoinCenter, Peter Van Valkenburgh. Peter, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Hi, Andy. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, just to clear the air really quickly for our listeners, and I want to get this out of the way immediately, Peter does not provide investment advice on any of the virtual currencies. So if you're looking on whether to buy or sell or which one, this ain't the place. So just to get that, Peter, I thought I'd do that as a public service to you.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah.
I've seen
CoinCenter's mission has never been to pump any currency or any technology and convince people to buy them or anything like that. We just want to make sure there's good information about these tools. We're personally excited about them, of course, but investment decisions are a whole nother matter.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I've been watching your Twitter feed, and you constantly have to say, look, folks, not me. This is not here. All right, we'll get to CoinCenter in just a second, but before we dive into that fun world of cryptocurrencies, I want to talk about your background a little bit. And you have a JD from NYU Law School, a BS in Econ from George Mason, and an associate's in dramatic arts from the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. But here's the question. This is a big windup, right, as you can tell. How did that last experience, the dramatic arts, help you for what you do today?
Oh, it's a good question. It's funny that you dug into my resume a little bit there.
Well, I do work for the federal government here, Peter.
Oh, dear.
I'm kidding. That was a joke. OGC, yeah. People, folks.
So before I went and got the econ degree and went to law school, I wanted to be a working actor for a number of years. And so I went to a conservatory program and did a pretty intensive training program, 2 years long, where you take a bunch of classes. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to say that it certainly helped me with voice and speech, given that I now give briefings and podcasts and all sorts of things all the time.
Right.
Although I think to some extent I was born with a little bit of that. My father was in radio, and his father was in radio, going all the way back to the 30s in New York City.
Wow.
So, but what it did do, modern acting training is, in addition to the technical stuff like voice and speech, really focused on being honest and present in a room with your scene partner. It's the kind of method acting where you should never be presenting to the audience. You're trying to be there with another person and help them understand, and you understand them, just to be honest in the moment and communicative.
Right, and that in a sense, focus, right? Focus on the other person.
Focus and emotionally available, which
nice.
Sounds like something you wouldn't expect to be important in like government advocacy, but I think it really is, because it's allowed me to be much more available to connect with people and really try maybe a little bit harder than I would have otherwise to understand, where there are gaps in their knowledge and where they have concerns about things, and be really honest with my answers. And I think that's part of what makes us, a useful and credible educator when it comes to this stuff, because we're ready to answer any questions and be as open as possible.
Well, I think it was said the path to enlightenment starts with humility. So I think that's a great way of approaching it. Can't imagine that we've gotten into that before we talked about cryptocurrencies, which is somewhat ironic. But let's talk about CoinCenter and your role there. When and how did the center start, and how did you get involved, Peter? Yeah,
so CoinCenter got its start in 2014, 2015, really 2014. And It began as kind of a ragtag informal partnership between a guy named Jerry Brito, who's my boss, who's formerly of the Mercatus Center, and at the time was just working at the Mercatus Center at George Mason, and an amazing woman named Robin Weissman, who never gets enough credit because she doesn't ever go on Twitter and talk about things publicly. Who was formerly government relations at NASDAQ for the Democrat side, and also at the Sternhell Group, which is a lobbying firm in D.C. And both of them had been sort of convinced by some charismatic and humble and generous people in the Bitcoin technology space, like people who most people haven't even heard of, and I'm not going to embarrass them by actually even mentioning their name on this podcast, but convinced by these people to go around to offices on Capitol Hill and educate people about Bitcoin, and pay for that kind of lobbying. And Robin is a lobbying expert. She's incredible. She knows everybody and is so friendly. And she wanted to bring an academic expert, Jerry, along. And so they were doing this just on, without any official name behind it for, I think about it, 6 months to a year, basically. And then some of these generous people really pressured them to kind of quit their day jobs and go start a full-time advocacy organization that would be a nonprofit dedicated to just doing this education role in Washington, D.C. And Jerry, apparently, he told me after the fact that he'd been looking to hire me when I graduated from NYU Law for a while to work at Mercatus. It's probably good evidence that Twitter is actually pretty great for career decisions, because I think that's where he first found out that I was interested in technology law and maybe had a few things to say that were worth listening to.
That's great.
And so he ended up hiring me for Coin Center as the director of research right when they were starting, rather than for the Mercatus Center. I was already down in D.C. working under a Google Policy Fellowship with another great nonprofit that does telecommunications advocacy in D.C. called Tech Freedom. But I had to pass up the opportunity to work there because I can't imagine a better and more exciting area of the law and technology to work in than cryptocurrencies.
It is fascinating, and I'm so glad I found you. There's ladies and gentlemen, he's put out some great pieces of research that you should, great in the sense that they're helpful for backgrounders, for understanding this world, and we're going to get into that right now. So we're going to start a little broadly and then get into the weeds a little bit. We'll get into the technology, but we're going to keep it, for people like me, we're going to try to keep this non-technical so I can understand it. But there's so many awesome aspects to this topic. So let's start at 40,000 feet. And here's a fun question. Why is blockchain technology not the solution to all of the world's problems?
I like that. I was expecting what is Bitcoin, but this is another good opening question. And maybe one that's a bit more reasoned, sane, and rational in light of the irrational exuberance we're seeing lately. So, why is blockchain not the solution to all the world's problems? It's not magic. Would be the first thing I'd say. It's a term that's used as if it's magic. You have any kind of political, social, organizational problem that you're dealing with, and you might think, given some of the early hype around blockchain technology, that we've finally got the solution, because you've seen any number of use cases touted for this technology, most of which are frankly still speculative, some of which are really starting to show real returns, like digital cash, like Bitcoin, which is one of these several blockchain technologies. The other thing I'd say is a blockchain is just a database. It's just ones and zeros. It's just
this inert. Has been around for a long time. I mean,
that's right.
In that sense, it's not really an innovation.
Right.
A recent innovation, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what the innovation is actually what I would call the consensus mechanism behind Bitcoin and some of the other follow-on cryptocurrencies.
Right. So before you get into that, I just want to say for the audience that there's like three things, and correct me if I'm wrong, three things that are tied together that people don't understand about Bitcoin and the really wonderful aspect of it. I mean, there's the peer-to-peer networking of how machines communicate with each other. That's been around for computers for a while. The blockchain, the data structure that you just talked about, that just connects the peers who use and store important variables and stuff in the shared computation. And sorry to interrupt you, but the consensus mechanism, that's the thing that's really interesting and innovative. And I think that's what gets me excited about it. And maybe you could go into that a little bit.
Yeah, totally. So absolutely agree that it's those three things together. And I think it's those three things together that people talk about when they talk about blockchain technology. The reason why blockchain is just one of those three things, but we call it blockchain technology, I think has a lot to do with branding. Blockchain sounds new and fun and exciting. Consensus mechanism sounds dull and boring, like we're going to have be sitting in a poorly lit fluorescent room in MIT discussing it and just sad. And then peer-to-peer networking reminds everybody of file sharing, which, depending on how you feel about copyright law, can be a sensitive subject.
Right. Good point.
So the consensus mechanism, which is one of those three components that makes blockchain technology work, in short, it's how we have all these networked computers. We have data that they're all compiling together, that shared data structure, that blockchain. The consensus mechanism is how to get all those network computers to agree, even if some of them are on the other side of the world, even if some of them go offline periodically, even if some of those computers might be run by malicious folks who want to actually inject fraudulent data into the blockchain. How can we still allow the group of people on the internet who want to keep this blockchain record, how can we still allow them to have faith in the data that gets added, to all agree and have consensus over what data should be in there and what data is fraud or violates the rules of the system and should never be in there? A consensus mechanism like that is just rules in software. So it's just a series of protocol rules, and if data is processed by the software that doesn't fit those rules, it's rejected by the participants. But the thing about consensus mechanisms is, up until the advent of Bitcoin, we've had consensus mechanisms since the 1980s. But up until the advent of Bitcoin, all of those consensus mechanisms relied on one fundamental fact about the network that they were helping the participants reach agreement within. And the fact that they relied upon was that the only participants in the consensus would be previously identified by an identifying authority, and they'd be provisioned with an authorization key, which is how that they'd prove to the other computers on the network that they should be involved in the consensus.
Right.
And so that distributed consensus mechanism with identity, or with permission, in other words, where only computers that have been granted permission can join, that goes back to the 1980s. There was an open source software stack called Paxos, and a research paper written about it, I think in '86. So it's almost exactly as old as I am. And it was used usually for companies like IBM to keep 6 massive data centers across the U.S. in sync with each other. One of them can go offline, and the rest of them will trudge onward unaffected. It's fault tolerant, but it's not fault tolerant to a bunch of random data centers joining that consensus. The whole artifice is predicated on the idea that IBM knows that it only has 6 data centers, gives each data center authentication data, and then when they all communicate with each other, they only listen to other authorized participants.
Right.
So that tech is old. Why am I talking about this? What does this have to do with Bitcoin and blockchain technology? Well, what is really innovative about Bitcoin in 2008 and 2009, when the network launched, is that the creator, whoever he, she, or they are or were, found a way to have useful consensus over data that didn't require all of the participants, or even any of the participants, to be previously identified and given a sort of authorization token. In other words, anybody who installs the Bitcoin software on their computer can join the network of Bitcoin computers on the internet that are working together and building a useful consensus over this data, the blockchain. Right. And that is actually radical, because It means that all you need in order to join the network and participate is an internet-connected device, which you probably have in your pocket right now, and free and open source software. And then you can help build the system that achieves some data-oriented result. And then the data-oriented result with Bitcoin is, of course, this ongoing compilation of Bitcoin transactions between members of the network, which can be used to describe these tokens, Bitcoins, and if there's only 21 million of them, as there are in the ledger, as it is described in the rules of the protocol, then they're scarce. And everyone can trust that scarcity because all of the computers are working together to secure that ledger of all of the transactions, and it indicates the scarcity of the number of tokens that can be transacted as well. Then you have peer-to-peer money transmission without any company in the middle. The only stuff in the middle is other computers on the network, and we're able to trust all of them, not because they have good reputations or they've been previously identified by a central planner like IBM with its data centers, but simply because the rules of the software, the rules of that open consensus mechanism, make it economically non-viable to commit fraud in that ledger. And so it's that open consensus mechanism that's radical, because before Bitcoin, before these open consensus mechanisms, you'd always have to trust an intermediary to do something like money transmission, for example, to keep a ledger of valid transactions.
Well, let me Peter, that was a lot to unpack. So let me back you up a little. No, that was really good. You just jumped and answered like 20 of my questions, but no.
I do that sometimes.
And that's totally cool because it saves me time. Well, let's get a little wonky here because for everyone at home, this is the thing that's so exciting. What Peter just described, and it's a key way that Bitcoin works with miners, right? And so the mining reward, and I want to get into this a little bit, is what you are compensated by both using your server, as you said, it's open architecture, so everybody can download it and participate, using your server and electricity to verify transactions, right? I mean, that's you get compensated with a mining reward by putting up that as your cost. And if you would just walk through how these guys get paid, the miners, and how much and how this is. I mean, you kind of laid out the theoretical underpinnings of what this system is. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty a little bit and kind of say, okay, given that, how does it actually work? Like, what are these incentives for these miners? And dive into that a little bit for me.
Right. So we've got all these computers on the peer-to-peer network, and we've got these software rules that allow them to reach an agreement over the data, and the data is the list of Bitcoin transactions. So why would you do this? Why would you join this crazy network of strangers on the internet to compile this ledger of made-up money? And it is, I'll admit it, it's made up, but it's made up in a way that's actually quite serious. Well, the deal is, if you participate and your participation is verified by the rest of the protocol, by the rest of the participants, in other words, everyone else can see that you participated according to the rules, then you will be rewarded in proportion to the amount of work you performed securing that ledger and verifying those transactions with a reward. And the reward will be you're allowed to actually write yourself a rather unique Bitcoin transaction. A normal Bitcoin transaction has to reference some funds that you've previously received before so that you can send them to someone else.
Right.
So you have an address. It's not your name. It's a random looking string of numbers and characters that your computer generated. People can send you Bitcoins at that address, and you can then ask for other people's addresses to send the Bitcoins on to them.
Right. The private key, right?
Right. You have the private key generated on your device, assuming you're not using a company like Coinbase to access Bitcoin, assuming you're doing it yourself. And the private key is generated in tandem with a public address, which is basically your account in the blockchain. And so people can send money to your account, and you can send money from your account to other people's accounts on the blockchain. But in order to authenticate that transaction message, you need to sign with your private key a digital signature saying, I'm spending from this public address, my public address. And anyone can check that the digital signature matches your public key, matches your address, to know that only the person who actually controls that address rightfully is the person sending the funds onward. But so any Bitcoin transaction, in order to be valid, has to have that input. These are the funds that I've received in the past that I'm now sending to someone else. You can't just make up Bitcoins out of thin air unless, and sorry to take a little circular path to this as well, unless you've performed the work to help secure the blockchain, unless you've honestly participated in that open consensus mechanism, then you will get the opportunity to write yourself a special transaction that has no source of funds. It creates Bitcoins out of thin air according to the rules of the protocol. So you can't just give yourself as many Bitcoins as you want when you write this transaction with no source of funds, but you can give yourself the amount that the money supply, which is preordained also in the rules of the software and the consensus mechanism, says that should be available now, given the release schedule for new Bitcoins. And the release schedule is every 10 minutes or so, we get another 12.5 Bitcoins right now. And one of the several participants who are securing the ledger basically wins a lottery, and they get to reward themselves with the 12.5 for that 10-minute period. And the thing about the mining reward is when Bitcoin started back in 2008, the mining reward was 50 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. Then in 4 years, it got cut in half to 25, and then again now to 12.5, and it will continue to decrease by half every 4 years or so until it's effectively zero, at which point you'll be rewarded not with new Bitcoins, but with fees. So that's the other part of the reward, is when people make transactions on Bitcoin, and they really want to make sure one of these several miners who's building the consensus and building the blockchain puts their transaction in as soon as possible, they can put voluntarily a fee on their transaction that will go to the miner. So the Bitcoin transaction is sending most of the Bitcoin from your address to somebody else's, but a small fee will go to the miner that picks up the transaction and puts it into a block in the blockchain. So the mining reward decreases by half every 4 years, which means eventually it goes to zero, which also means that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in circulation. And at the moment, there's about 15 million, maybe 16 now. And you will also be able to reward yourself with fees from transactions when you do this mining roll. Now, mining is not the best name for it because miners kind of just do something that has no social benefit. They make giant holes in the earth in order to enrich themselves with gold. In the case of Bitcoin, you are doing something of social benefit. You're securing that ledger of transactions. You're participating in an open consensus mechanism to agree on important data, on the order of payments. And you're rewarded for that participation if it's verified and honest. But it is similar to mining in the sense that you have to do some hard work, which will require sophisticated computers and a fair amount of electricity in order to participate and in order to get that reward if you do it successfully. So Bitcoin mining is, it's like the nightmare question, like what is mining? Because it has all of these weird associations with it, and it is actually the very heart and meat of the technology. I've glossed over a bunch of things here, like, all right, well, how do we pick which miner to actually win the block reward? And it has to do with provably solving a difficult math equation. And then you could say, oh, well, what the heck do you mean difficult math equation? And I mean, well, it's actually a hash function. Yeah. And then we could go further and further, but maybe we should stop there for now.
You just lost half the listeners. No, I'm kidding. No. And I think that's, so talking broadly, I think that's what is so helpful, is to understand that component of Bitcoin. What I would say is really the truly exciting component of it is the consensus mechanism and diving into the weeds a bit on mining. So I just want to be really clear about this. So the miners can create about 12.5 Bitcoins per 10 minutes for solving the transaction protocol, I'll just call it that, even though I've just used the wrong words, but for solving the problem, right, of verifying the transactions. Is there any other way for within the 21 million limit that they have that Bitcoin can be created?
No,
Okay,
that is the only way that Bitcoins enter circulation.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make that really clear point for people that are out there, because I can't tell you how many people go, yeah, the miners just go out and they dig up the Bitcoin and then they put it into the system. I'm like, no, that's not how it works.
Yeah,
So
for example, like if you were a miner and you thought you did like extra work, you just did a really good job securing the blockchain, and you wanted to award yourself 100 instead of 12.5.
Right.
And you broadcast basically all the work you did and your transaction and any other transactions that you're adding to the blockchain, and your transaction says 100 new Bitcoins to me. The rest of the network, because they all follow the rules of the software, because their software checks every scrap of data that's shared on the network, will look at the data you just shared and say that data is invalid. It's prima facie invalid according to the rules of the consensus mechanism, and it'll just be ignored. So you could spit into the wind. You could try as hard as you want to just create extra Bitcoins, but it'll just be like screaming in an empty forest, which that got really dark really fast. Probably the wrong metaphor. What's it going to be like?
It's all right. You were born in the 80s. You watched way too many slasher movies, I have a feeling, but that's okay. So here's just a quick yes or no answer. So can a government be a miner?
Oh, sure. I mean, there may be ethics rules or any number of other things to contend with, but there'd be no reason from a technical standpoint why a state actor couldn't decide to run some mining servers and install the free and open source software. It's permissionless, which means even governments can play.
Interesting. Let me just switch gears a little bit. In your booklet, which I think is really been helpful for understanding not only your perspective, but also what's going on in this space, you have a booklet called Why Openness Matters, and you make this statement. Open blockchain networks need scarce tokens for technical reasons, not merely because their proponents may have a political or ideological motivation for supporting alternative currencies. Can you unpack that a little bit and explain it for our audience, what you're referring to there, the need for scarcity?
Absolutely, yeah. So the main reason why, until Bitcoin, any kind of peer-to-peer money transmission system involved a central intermediary, like a bank or like PayPal, was because otherwise, aside from Bitcoin, digital items, like an MP3 file that's a David Bowie song that you like, they can be endlessly replicated at effectively no cost.
Right.
It's cut and paste and cut and paste. There's no limit to how many times you can cut and paste the same sentence in a Word document. So ones and zeros are not scarce. And so we always relied on a centralized intermediary to keep track of payments. Peter gave up this thing, and now Andy has it. And this is how we make sure that I don't give up the same thing 5 times, because that's not giving it up.
Right.
That's just counterfeiting. And so when we move to a system like Bitcoin, we remove the centralized intermediary and replace it with an open system for building data of the same payment order to stop the double spending problem. But we don't have any trusted intermediaries there. We just have people who are behaving rationally and running software that follows the rules of the consensus mechanism. Why would they do this? They have no reason to do this unless they are rewarded with something in return for their honest computational work and their honest effort at maintaining this ledger and making a system that might have a real social value, like peer-to-peer money transmission, work. They need to be rewarded with something. And so this is why in the mining reward in Bitcoin and in similar rewards for being a transaction validator or a block maker in Ethereum or Zcash or the other cryptocurrencies, you have this ability to grant yourself new tokens for your honest participation. Now, you might say, well, why not just reward honest participation with dollars? Why do we have this weird thing called a Bitcoin and all the odd quasi-libertarian internet memes and things like that it comes with? It's got some baggage, right? And I'm part of that baggage. I really like internet memes. But like Jamie Dimon thinks it's strange, right? And he definitely thinks it's strange. Why not just pay the miners in dollars? Well, the problem is if you inject dollars into the system, then you need somebody to process the payments again. Mm-hmm. You'd need somebody to keep track of the honest behavior of all the miners and make payroll. And they'd need to use, I don't know, ACH transfer or Visa or MasterCard or some other.
In China, then you got to convert the currency and all of that as well.
Exactly. So at that point, it's game over. You've reinvented PayPal or Venmo. You might as well just hire a team to verify transactions and keep a ledger rather than using a decentralized network to do it. Yeah. But if you make the reward native to the actual ledger itself, so the ledger keeps track of Bitcoins, and people who honestly maintain the ledger are allowed to reward themselves with new Bitcoins in the ledger, then everything ends up subject to the rules of the software, and nothing is left to the discretion of the actors. It's just all part of the system. There's no conversion outside of the system where we rely on a trusted intermediary. Now, you might say, well, but Peter, there is conversion outside of the system. There are these exchanges where you can buy Bitcoins with dollars, and that's true. But that has nothing to do with keeping the ledger. That's just somebody making a business trading Bitcoins on the ledger for dollars off the ledger. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of companies that do that, like Coinbase. The actual raw protocol of Bitcoin, the thing that allows you to send Bitcoins to other people across the world, that's not a company. That's just software. And the only way to make that system work is to reward honest participants with new Bitcoins.
Okay, well, we're running out of time here, and there's so much more to cover. So before I ask my last question, can I get you to promise to come back on the show and continue the conversation?
Totally, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so last question. From where you sit at Coin Center, what are the top 3 areas you're going to focus on in 2018?
Yeah, so most of our work early on focused on state money transmission licensing because a lot of those businesses that make markets that exchange dollars for Bitcoins, for example, like Coinbase,
right?
They might or might not fall under state money transmission licensing laws because every state has a differently drafted law. And so we've been doing this for 3 years, going state to state and helping them rationalize their legal structure so that we can at least have a good answer, yes or no. And if yes, then have the requirements be reasonable so that Coinbase can get licensed and other companies can get licensed. And the other problem here is, what if you're just running software? You're not actually holding other people's Bitcoins. You probably shouldn't be regulated as a money transmitter because you don't actually create risks to consumers. You don't hold their money. You just write software that they use to hold their own money. But the laws are all drafted differently, and in some states, the laws could actually make it look like there's an obligation to get licensed even for a software provider. And I don't think we'll rely on discretion to stop an enforcement against someone who really isn't a money transmitter being treated as one. But I think it'd be better to rely on law rather than discretion. So we should change the laws where they're ambiguous and vague to make it clear that someone who's just making software isn't a money transmitter. And this is a mess. It's 53 states and territories. So we worked with the Uniform Law Commission to draft a model state regulation of virtual currency businesses act, which they finally finalized after almost 2 years of notice and comment and meetings and talking. And we think it's awesome. They were good enough to look to us for some essential definitions, the most essential definition being when is a company actually holding Bitcoin for someone else? Because those are the companies, the ones that hold Bitcoin for other people, that you want to regulate. You don't want to regulate companies that aren't holding it for other people. Mm-hmm. So one of our big fights will be trying to get this model law from the Uniform Law Commission, which it's nice that it has a great organization behind it, passed into law in the several states. The other big area that we're watching, of course, is the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this has a lot of background associated with it to get people to understand. You could do a whole show on ICOs and token sales. But the long and short of it is some people are selling tokens that will exist on a network, just like Bitcoins exist on Bitcoin, before the network is built. And when they do that, there's a good argument from a legal standpoint that they might be issuing securities. And most of them aren't registering with the SEC when they do that. So in theory, many of them are unregistered securities issuers. And there's also a bunch of people who are actually just committing fraud by convincing others that that's what they're going to do, but they're really not going to do anything. And that's securities fraud. So we're really working hard and have been since 2015, but we'll continue to do as much education and outreach to the SEC, to the commissioners, to the staff, to make sure they have the tools necessary to go after the scams and really the unregistered securities issuance activities without, in an overbearing way, crushing the fundamental innovations here.
All right, Director of Research at coincenter.org, Peter Van Valkenburgh, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, Andy. I'm sorry I talk so much.
No, it's just like I'm just sitting here taking notes and writing stuff. This is great. So thank you again. All right, that's a wrap for CFTC Talks this week. Remember, if you want to hear more podcasts, you can go on our website and at cftc.gov and click on the podcast button. Or you can find us on iTunes by searching for CFTC Talks on your podcast app. We'll be back next week with another guest on our quest to learn about the markets we watch. I'm Andy Bush. Thanks for listening. But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.